America's Reckless Bet Explained, featuring Jonathan D. Cohen. What is happening with sports betting? Jonathan D. Cohen, author of the illuminating Losing Big, America's Reckless Bet on Sports Gambling, Cohen traces the astonishing evolution of sports wagering from the underground parlors to online sportsbooks lobbying for legalization. We dive into what happened with legislation in 2018 and before, the consequences for certain populations, and what this monumental shift means for the future of betting culture. Whether you're a casual fan or a policy advocate, this conversation sheds light on the high stakes of America's gambling drive and what we can do to reduce the risk. Our guest today is Jonathan D. Cohen, who is the author of Losing Big, America's Reckless Bet on Sports Gambling, and For a Dollar and a Dream, State Lotteries in Modern America. You can learn more at www.jonathancohen.com. I want to welcome Jonathan Cohen to Talking Addiction and Recovery podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really want to start by really appreciating the book that you wrote. We're going to talk about Losing Big, America's Reckless Bet on Sports Gambling. And I want to say a couple of things just to get going is one, there's such a lack of books and knowledge and resources on gambling in general that to see this book that you wrote and published and read it, I was so taken back because I remember when I first got into gambling counseling, I remember someone, told me gambling is, 20 years behind substance use and mental health. And we don't get a lot of things released, published on it. And to see something like sports betting, which we're going to talk a lot about, 2018 being the big year, and then you publish this book already, pretty, quickly, I would say, compared to usual, is I'm really appreciative of the work that you did with this. I was actually taken back.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I to get not to give myself too much credit, but the reason I was able to publish it relatively quickly, I would say two reasons. First is my last book is on the state lottery system. So when the Supreme Court decision came down in 2018, I was already sort of deep in the throes of a book about lotteries, and my work on this book sort of started as that book came out. So right in 2022 is when I sort of picked this up. And then also candidly, it's just a short book. I felt that I sort of felt some of the urgency that's sort of implicit in your comment. And I this is not the 300 page, 600 page sort of encyclopedic sort of soup to nuts sort of version. It is I do think it has a little bit of a soup to nuts story, but my goal was to tell like 80% of the story in 50% of the time. And there are books that are coming out this year or late or next year that are going to like really be protracted, take the inside story of every single little micro decision and this and that. And I was like, okay, we can be comprehensive, but we can still stay on the surface. And most importantly, for readers these days, we can be short and we can be quick and we can be accessible. And that was the goal.
Yeah, you covered so much, and I when I we talk about how quick to read it or be able to go through it, like I read it in 2 days. Like I took it with me camping for a weekend, and I was like, I went through it. But it was historical. There was storytelling, statistics, data. There was, stories from people impacted by it. I mean, it feels like it covered so much for a book that isn't like the 500, 600 page volume, that you really put everything together. Like if someone were to say, what's going on with sports betting? I feel like this is the book to give them, to be like, here's what you need to know, or here's the 101 in like a quick way to understand it. I feel like that's what you created with this
Yeah.
book.
Well, yeah, but this is my own self-effacing inclination is like I can't not see what I didn't get to. Oh, I would have loved to have a chapter about like the media and how the media has how like sports media has transformed into gambling media. But yes, that's really to me is like the one like oh man, if I had another 6 weeks, like I would have done another chapter on that. But to your point, maybe it's better without it. Maybe it's better just like short, quick starting point, and then people if they're interested, if they want to dive in further, I tons of great journalists work on this issue whose work I can recommend or these other books. But yeah, it's meant to be or was meant to be the first sort of synthetic causes and consequences of the nation's, pun intended, bet on sports betting over the last 7 years.
And you mentioned you wrote another book I saw on the lottery. I didn't read that yet. It's on my
It's a lot
list.
longer. It's a lot longer.
Um,
Yeah.
have you what's been your interest in gambling, in particular with writing that book, now this one?
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of. sort of happenstance. I guess all these things sort of are luck based, ha ha ha. But I really was interested in graduate school in themes of the American dream and in economic inequality, and really the lottery sort of stumbled into the lottery basically as a way to tell that story. I think I was sort of predisposed or inclined to tell it and to access, the American dream through something like the lottery because I'm a board game player and I'm interested in sort of games and play generally, but I didn't like show up to grad school on the first day and be like, man, I gotta write a history. I was just like, okay, I'm interested in these topics. What's a proxy? What's like a little sort of micro story of American history that I can tell that gets at this topic? And then sports betting, I mean, I'm a sports fan. I like ran a picks pool in high school in 2007. Shout out to Gann Academy. But like, I'm not like a big sports bettor. I'm not even much of a bettor myself. But it really was a matter of it felt like almost political urgency, right? The Murphy decision comes out in 2018. Sports betting in 2022 is so clearly changing. And really all I had to go on was I already have, knowledge base about how to write about gambling and how to tell a story about gambling and gambling policy. And like something weird seems to be going on. Like truly, that was like all I had. And the New York Times investigative series came out in 2022 was the first sort of like ending of the honeymoon, let's say, with sports betting. And all I had was like, hey, there's more, there has to be more to this story than like a couple of New York Times pieces. And so what is it? And it was as much for my own curiosity, again, as a sports fan and as someone interested in gambling, as it was for, let's call it a public service for people like you who are, immersed in the topic, but without the historical perspective or maybe the bird's eye view that a book like this can provide.
And 2018, I think, is going to be a year a lot of us in this profession, in this work, are going to remember. For those who don't know, what do they mean 2018? What do they mean the Supreme Court? Like,
Yeah.
what would your best way to tell listeners as to the significance of what happened then, as to why we're so much talking about what's going on now in 2025 and what's going to be going forward?
Yeah. I mean, the one sentence version is that sports gambling was legalized or was possible to be legalized because of a 2018 Supreme Court decision. The slightly longer version is that in 1992, Congress passed a law that blocked states from legalizing sports betting. So states weren't allowed to legalize sports betting even if they wanted to. And in 2018, the Supreme Court overturned that law. So the Supreme Court didn't make sports betting legal, but it allowed states to legalize it if they wanted to. And so it's now been a little over 7 years, right? 38, soon to be this year, 39 states have now legalized sports betting. 30, soon to be 31, plus Washington, D.C., have legalized it online. And so the Supreme Court, again, didn't legalize it, but sort of opened the floodgates for states to make this decision for themselves.
And one of the things you did in your book so great is you provided a lot of the background story to some of the specific states and like what they did and like what was going on. It seemed like in some cases there were people who very well knew what they were doing with the intent of, legislation and doing this, but then also sometimes once it happened, then there was a lot that became unknown or a lot that was not prepared for, where kind of like a gold mine rush to go do this. And then I think now we're starting to see some of those things of happening that was either not paid attention to, maybe intentionally missed or not wanting to. But you gave some examples of some states, and so what was that like for you to kind of look at how different ones, what they were trying to do or what they able to do, and some of like the learning things since it's happened? Because I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of good points that were taken away from that.
Right. So I'll also maybe this I'm supposed to wait until the end of the podcast to give up my whole thesis, but like this is sort of the thesis, right? And this is in the title of the book is the word reckless, and I think that's the key word, which is my sense that or my belief that the sports gambling should be legal, maybe even online sports gambling should be legal, but the way it was rolled out and the way it was unfurled in this country in the aftermath of the 2018 Supreme Court decision was reckless and was unnecessarily reckless. And the speed, the alacrity with which states embraced it, and the manner with which they embraced it, specifically sort of to your point, the lack of guardrails that many put up. And that's sort of going to be my answer for everything. And so my just to your question, my sort of profile, I guess, of in the book is on the state of Colorado and how Colorado within a matter of, just a couple months and with a lot of encouragement from gambling lobbyists and FanDuel and DraftKings, legalize sports betting and specifically legalize it in such a way that is friendly to sportsbooks and lacking in guardrails to protect gamblers. Um, and again, that's sort of my point is maybe it was smart. Maybe we should have. Maybe I would even endorse a version of online sports betting or legalized sports betting. But the way it was done was like, okay, the Supreme Court decision allows states to do it, and then lo and behold, all these lobbyists from gambling companies show up writing the bills or influencing the bills for these states, and that's how we get to where we are today, which is what I think, a point of not just lacking guardrails, but like a borderline crisis or a full-on crisis of public health proportions in terms of the number of people affected. So I didn't actually answer your question about the sort of specific cases, but that's sort of the overall thesis and how the fact that this was sort of thrown to the states, and then the states were like, "Oh, okay, I guess we can decide sports gambling for ourselves now." And then the sports gambling companies were like, "Hey, I guess you can decide sports gambling for yourselves now." And that's how I think sort of how we got to this point where we are today.
In Colorado, wasn't Colorado the one with the water? Like there was the water issue where like to me there's also been a lot of promises with sports betting and like a lot of promises with like what will happen with like revenue or what will happen with like tax stuff and I'm not recalling specifically, but I think that's another area where a lot of the things about what's been promised or what's going to come from it, like, are we seeing that happening? Like, I think of that with like the opioid settlement funds, right? Because I work in substance use as well. And like, we hear about like funds that were from this to help with this. And then it's like, well, where are those? Those aren't there yet. They're going somewhere else. Like, I kind of feel like sports betting is kind of on a potential similar path where some of the promises of what this will do is that what we're seeing? Is there a way to make sure that that's where that's going? Any takes on that?
Yeah. Okay, it's an interesting question. So I would say in most states, sports betting was done by the legislature and it didn't have sort of a specific cause attached to it. Like the lottery has a lot of cause, like it's in Massachusetts, it's local cities and towns, and Pennsylvania, it's elder care, and lots of other states, it's education, like New York. And the most sport in most states, sports betting isn't like that. It was just like sort of done most of the time during COVID by the legislature because they saw it as free money, and they always see gambling as sort of free money as just a way to increase revenue without taxes. Okay, fine. Colorado was different, and one of the reasons I picked it is because they had this water plan attached. It's like it was going to fund water conservation in Colorado, and that the reason they had to do that was because of weird tax laws in Colorado, it had to go before voters in a referendum. And again, one of the other reasons I picked it, it was the first state after New Jersey a couple of years ago that had a public referendum rather than just like a bunch of lawmakers sort of deciding this issue for themselves. Fine. Okay. So this is my long way of getting to the point, which is on paper, sports betting is basically meeting revenue expectations of the kind of the hopes that had been attached to it in terms of the projections. This is not like I'm not going to spoil the whole lottery book, but like people had all these fantastical projections for lotteries when those were enacted, and it has not met any of them. Fine. So on paper, sports betting is in many cases in many states meeting, the budgetary expectations. But in Colorado, it's not meeting like let's call it like the political expectations. It wasn't like marketed as like, hey, let's raise 0.01% of our water plan conservation fund, like from the sports betting. It was like, hey, if you want to save the water, vote for sports betting. And so again, on paper, it's like meeting the cap. It's meeting the sort of threshold of what the expectation that politicians sort of marketed it as. But in the grand scheme of the actual water plan, it's like it's pun intended a drop in the bucket. So like yes and no. Of course, it's like all tax-free government revenue is helpful and useful for government, but first of all, in the grand scheme, it's still this drop in the bucket. And then the second part, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, is like at what cost, right? At what cost are we raising this government revenue? Is this really where government should be getting its money?
I think part of it comes to is like when we in my area with being, like a counselor, treatment, all that is part of it is like I think people assuming some of this money is going towards, treatment, prevention, education, research on gambling harms and all that. I think some people see like the large amount of money coming in and they're just like, yeah, of course there's got to be some that's going towards that. But
Which there is in most states, but
yeah,
yeah.
but there's also just there's a lot there that still is tough for us because we've always struggled with for
What do you mean?
treatment
Gambling counselors aren't
prevention.
sitting on giant piles of cash with their
Yeah.
golden thrones, you know, what I mean, with all the problem gambling money that comes in.
Yeah. So it's like really hard that that's something it's to this is going on and how are we going to be equipped to help address some of the harms, which your book does talk about.
Yeah. Well, I'll say just to the point about sort of recklessness, and even so, Colorado, just because that's my sort of case study, allocated all of $130,000 for problem gambling for the entire state, for like however many million people live in Colorado. I think it's 8 million people. They had $130,000 allocated from in sports betting in the original legislation. And then even that got taken away during COVID when the state had a budget crunch. So it's like they had no RG conversation, they had no prep, they had no they were a vanishingly or astonishingly small number of IGCC certified counselors in the state before legalization, and they did nothing to like prepare. It was just like, how can we get this up as quickly as possible? And only later, right, in a sort of follow-up legislation 2 years later, did they like allocate more money and start allocating more money to it. And even so, it's like, is it offsetting the costs? I don't know. But like the Andrew Shires in Colorado are, I promise, are not like calling in from their gold-plated therapy rooms. You know, it's not that kind of money. So no, you're right. The public perception or misperception of how much money is allocated is really important. And again, it comes back, as it will always will for me, to the fact that it didn't have to be this way, that we could have gone slower, we could have done a better job, we could have allocated this money from the start rather than rushing headlong into things, realizing the mistakes we made, realizing the lack of money that we have allocated, and then filling in the gap later.
And by that time it's going to cost more. Like that's the
Yeah,
purpose of
right.
prevention. It can also be to make the harms and the costs of it can decrease versus when you're then dealing with it like way after the fact and things have gotten even worse.
And there's a slow pipeline, right? You can't just like snap your fingers and there's like 10 new IGCC certified counselors in your state, right? Like it takes many years and it's an expensive, you know better than me, accreditation process. And like, okay, the state's now gonna fund some of the accreditation for you to like incentivize more counselors. All right, see you in 5 years, and like maybe we'll have half as many counselors as we need. You know, it's just like there's no sort of there was no thoughtfulness in planning in going into this in the first place.
And I would say something that I'm curious to know where you are and what you've seen with this, because, as someone who's worked with substance use for a lot of my career, like there's always been like drug trends and things have changed. And we went from where we were before to even like where we are now. But like also gambling is changing and it's changing so rapidly, where I think your book also did a good job of it. It wasn't just what people were able to gamble on, but it's also how people gambled. It was through a phone, but it was also you can bet now, you know, mid-game versus like just beforehand. You could bet on like a player, the impact with collegiate athletes, like the sports betting didn't just change what to bet on, but also rapidly changed how people gamble. And like you said, by the time we could get to this 5 years later, how gambling might be then could be entirely different.
Totally. And this is where like so this is all Chris Christie's fault, right? The reason we have legal sports gambling is he instigated the lawsuit that got us to the Supreme Court decision. And if you got him in a room and injected him with truth serum and said, "Hey, when you sort of started this crusade that eventually led to the Supreme Court decision, were you envisioning that it was going to be legal to gamble on Malaysian women's doubles badminton at 3 in the morning, or did you want people to like bet on like the Giants over under for the season, win losses for the season?" And he's probably would I would guess in the latter. He was not imagining that you could bet on like whether the next pitch in the Guardians game is going to be 88 miles an hour or not, or whatever. You know what I mean? And so you're totally right. With the version we have of gambling is different from what we had before, and is more dangerous than we've had before. And this is in other than a couple states that had online lottery tickets, sports betting was the first legal online gambling writ large. So not just sort of did we run headlong into this sort of excitedly, but we ran on headlong into this without really knowing what this is and where we were going and the sort of the consequences that maybe this is only obvious in retrospect of like unleashing legal gambling onto every cell phone in the state. Like, oh yeah, like why should we be surprised that that's going to sort of run people into trouble?
Yeah, it was. I remember in one of the areas that's been highlighted with sports betting in particular has been like emerging adults and like
Yeah.
young youth and emerging adults has been a big topic for like
Young men
paying
especially.
attention to
Yeah.
young men.
Yep.
But I also say like this is also like, we used to say, this isn't your grandma's marijuana anymore. We're like, this is also not your grandparents' way of gambling. But I also know like there's a lot of I think we also need some younger professionals or some people who this is what they've worked with and dealt with, because some of the people who've been doing gambling work for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, to them this is like someone who's been, you know not using heroin for 20 years and they've never even dealt with fentanyl. Like
Right.
now there's people who've been in this profession for a while who are dealing with like the casino gambling style or like similar things like that, and now like they're being challenged with sports betting when they've never even used a sports betting app. They've never gone to a sports betting kiosk. Like they've never even engaged in it. But like to me, like you can't not know about sports betting right now. Like you have to be aware of some of the in and outs of sports betting in particular, not just I know about gambling. Like sports betting's kind of taken on a little bit of its own in its whole thing with this area.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll defer to you as sort of the treatment professional in terms of like how a treatment provider might treat it differently. But yeah, I think not your grandma's slot machine or whatever you want to like. It's totally right. It's a different animal. It's a different beast. Even putting aside all the sort of little tricks of the app and the Malaysian women's doubles badminton and stuff like that, just the fact you have it in your pocket, right? And the my byword for this is friction, and just the lack of friction of both access because it's in your pocket, the design of the apps. They can't like pump oxygen through your phone and like hide all the windows and put no clocks up like they do at the casino, but they sort of like have all the other little dopamine tricks on the app to sort of keep you engaged in the same way and to create it frictionless as possible. And it's just a totally different beast and is a totally and again I defer to you when it comes to how the treatment plan, for example, might have to differ, but acknowledging that someone addicted to slot machines in the 1980s is their experience of gambling addiction is in many ways similar, but in many ways absolutely completely different from, a 25-year-old addicted to sports betting today.
Yeah. But one area that I do want to ask you about, because I was so gracious to see you talk about this, because I feel like in the age of sports betting, online gambling, there was the idea that bookies are now gone, that bookies have disappeared, and that's one of the arguments that some people make for legalizing gambling is, well, then you take away the illegal parts of it, which then
Yeah.
it's like in the dark, then it goes unregulated. You know that the consequences there can be such so different. But you did mention bookies in your book, and I was really glad because I feel that is an area that people are almost acting like that doesn't exist. But when I've heard some people that I've worked with, some professionals that share their stories, bookies are still very much alive and they are still a part of sports betting and gambling. So can you touch a little bit on that? Because I felt that was so great to read about, because I felt people were thinking this is gone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just fundamentally, illegal gambling is never going away. There are people who will always, always, always choose the black market. With bookies, you can bet on credit. You don't have to file your taxes. There are also people who like to prefer to play offshore. Maybe for them, it's their taxes too, whatever. And so fundamentally, what it comes down to for me is, first of all, not only do we have a bunch of states, including Texas, Georgia, and California, they don't even have legal sports betting yet. So why shouldn't we, why should we expect any impact on bookies, in those states? Um, what we've basically done is normalized sports betting and raised the profile of sports betting such that maybe people who never would have even dreamt of gambling in the first place or wouldn't have been exposed to it are now exposed to it. Yeah, probably a majority of those people, maybe even a vast majority of them, are going onto legal licensed apps like FanDuel, DraftKings, wherever. But some of them are probably just going to the legal markets, either for the reasons I mentioned or just because they have someone at their frat house or wherever who they know who will book bets for them. And so to me, we sort of need that needs to be baked into our model, sort of as you're saying, is the persistence of the illegal market. And I think when it comes to regulation and when it comes to building up guardrails, we the the American Gaming Association and these companies sort of they say, oh, you can't increase our tax rates. Oh, you can't add guardrails. All you're going to do is push people into the black market. You're going to push them to bookies. You're going to push them to these casinos based in Antigua or wherever? And the answer is no. People are always going to find their way to those platforms if they want to, when they want to. They're easy to find. They always have been. They always will be. And that doesn't mean just because crack cocaine is available that we shouldn't like regulate cocaine or something. I don't know what the metaphor is, but yes, I think it needs to be. I guess treatment providers need to understand that not all the gambling that's happening is legal gambling, but that also the threat of illegal gambling may even be greater because of the normalization and the raised profile of betting writ large.
Yeah, that's that's a good thing to consider because I think that's where some people are thinking like if we do this, that gets rid of this entirely. And I'm always like, we getting rid of something entirely like is like when do we really do that? Because like we
And
like
yeah, I would say you're not even getting rid of it like at all potentially.
yeah,
Like in fact, you might even be like augmenting it. Yeah.
yeah. In your I know you focus on the US. Have you come across anything about what other countries may have done? I was at the national conference last week. I was presenting there, and I attended one that was by advertising research in the UK, and they were kind of talking about how other countries were kind of doing some things, and their main focus, I would say, was based on like advertising.
Yeah.
They're talking a lot about how trying to regulate not necessarily sports betting, but regulate how much, how often, or ways in which places can market with advertising. So I'm just curious if during your research and in the work that you've done, did you come across like things that you've heard about other countries and things about what they're trying to do and how that's kind of in comparison to where we are with the timeline? Because we weren't the first country to do this either. There was other countries
Far from. Yeah. Yeah.
that did it
No,
before us. So
yeah.
curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so the high level point here is that other countries, through their ad regulation, as you point out, or through other measures, are basically currently in the process of undoing and reversing the exact kind of sort of lack of guardrails, free for all betting framework that we are currently building in the United States. You know, the United Kingdom, which you mentioned, right, has had legal sports betting since 1961, legal online sports betting since 2005, and is now in response to primarily a wave of suicide of young men, sort of with gambling addictions, in the process of rolling it back and in the process of fixing it and really sort of coming to terms with the consequences of legal online sports betting and online sports betting in general. So, I mean, we're America. We don't have to learn from anybody. That's our birthright as Americans, I guess. But I think we do have a lot to learn, and indications are that if we don't pay attention to what's going on in other countries, then 5, 10, 20 years from now, we're going to be in the exact situation they are, in the process of we're going to finally, as Australia is doing, for example, enact a whistle to whistle ad ban, so during a sports game from the start of the game to the end of the game, no gambling ads, which the advertising, which you mentioned, is so important because of the normalization, because of the way that it raises profile, it exposes children who are watching the games to sports betting, and that's how you find out basically about sports betting and about accessing it. So there are lots of other countries that are doing lots of other things, but I totally agree. Advertising has always sort of, I think, the first domino to fall. Might not be the first domino I would pick here in the U.S. I have other things I would want to pick up on, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's where sort of our focus again might be 20 years from now, but that's where our focus sort of ends up starting when it comes to reform.
And it was interesting because the speaker, his one of his closing statements was, because he was like, this all sounds like doom and gloom. And he was like, I do believe the US will get to the point we are, that we're now in the earlier parts where we're making it legal, where we don't have the safeguards, we're kind of going, and then he's like, sure enough, down the road, could be years later, don't know, but then sooner or later, you're going to start thinking about the changes with ads and the changes with
Right,
marketing.
right.
And uh, it sounds like part of him is accurate in detailing that we're where a lot of other people are. And when we get there, it might be different, but like we are in that point of not a lot of guardrails, I guess I would say
Yeah.
currently. And
And
that's scary for some people, especially, parents and sometimes my treatment providers like myself, where we're kind of recognizing we need the guardrails while other people are driving the car, you know, put to the pedal. Like, what would you say to those of us and others who are worried about that, and they say we need these, but we also that time might not be right now because of just how things are going.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I would love to say that we have a conscientious and well-designed system of government that can respond quickly to major problems and can address them. But we don't. Congress doesn't do anything, not to mention anything sort of smart and sort of with foresight. And at the state level, you sort of have this problem where these are state agencies charged with raising money for government, and they are loath to sort of interfere with raising money for government, even on behalf of player protection. So yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think treatment providers are doing. I think providers, let's say, need to be, let's say, half of the solution. We need to have a system in place, a stronger system in place to take the guardrails metaphor to, fish people out of the river when they've fallen in. And again, talking about, increasing the pipeline of certified providers and providing outpatient and inpatient treatment opportunities and venues and so on. But then we also need, and we're going to need that no matter what. No matter how many guardrails we put up, we're going to need sort of a more robust system of treatment. But then we also need the guardrails to prevent people from falling in the first place. Some of these guardrails could be imposed by the sports gambling companies. You can guess how likely I think that is going to happen. But they really could if they wanted to, or it could be imposed by regulators. Again, I'm not super bullish on those prospects. It could be happened by Congress if Congress decides to do anything. So yes, I agree with you. We need it. I don't know. I don't. I'm wary that it's going to take a United Kingdom style reckoning, or some celebrity getting into trouble, or some son of some politician getting into trouble, or something, until the real political momentum is there to either at a state level or at a federal level impose some of these guardrails that would, as a treatment provider, sort of complement the work you're doing, up for further upstream.
And one of the areas that's interesting is the impact on athletes. I think from professional to collegiate, like it's interesting how, I mean, it's becoming more frequently now where you hear about someone getting in trouble for gambling when they're like a professional athlete. There was a recent article, it was a couple weeks ago, that mentioned someone, baseball player who was suspended or investigated. You hear about schools getting in trouble. You hear about sometimes the harassment that
Yep.
players get from it because of their team won, but they didn't score 12 points. They scored 11. Um, so it's interesting also that the very thing that's being bet on is also having some implications or consequences as a result. And I'm concerned at how sometimes that impacts, just the game in general or impacts players, athletes. So what am I question? I know that's not a question.
Yeah. No, no,
But
but sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking about the fact that this changed how we gamble with online digital, and it seems like this is so unique compared to other things because even things like self-exclusions becoming digital, right? Like it used to be talk to the casino and then they would do all that, and now it's like the self-exclusion is becoming digital. Like how people pay for this is digital, right? Like how they gamble is digital. Like it seems like a lot of this is going online digital, and then also like how we're gonna learn from it, how are we gonna track things, how are we gonna apply these tools is also going to be through some digital platform. I was involved in research at UNLV where they were doing chatbots, AI chatbot research for responding to gambling questions. And they had me as a counselor type in my responses and they had me review things. But it feels like you also have to start getting more aware of like online digital stuff because this is where a lot of it is going, which is not the same when we're doing substance use, we're doing some other things, but gambling's entering a complete digital platform, and even how we address it is becoming digital. Any thoughts on that or feedback from like what you've seen with how that's going to play a role in things?
Yeah, I mean it's 2025. Like, should we be surprised that people are, want to or expecting to, use credit cards to gamble to the same, for example, they watch. TV on their phone, they date on their through their phones, they watch movies on their phone. Why should we be surprised that they want to also gamble on their phones if they are going to gamble? And to our conversation earlier, no, I don't think, or I don't think the scale of treatment availability, not to mention maybe the treatments themselves have sort of correspondingly matched the rising potential for harm. And the National Council on Problem Gambling has all this data on, why online sports betting is more dangerous, or sorry, online gambling in general is more dangerous than in-person gambling. Again, I think because of the sort of lack of friction. And I think, frankly, that we're still sort of coming to terms with it. And it's unquestionable that this is a sort of digital problem. Not that, casinos are perfect and no one ever ran into trouble, and we shouldn't maybe regulate casinos better and so on. But the number of people who are going to run into trouble who never would have otherwise, maybe never even would have otherwise gambled, specifically because betting is now available on their phone. That to me is just incontrovertible. And I don't know. I don't know like the exact solution, but I know that the scale of the need is going to be so much greater because of the digital component, and maybe we probably, in all honesty, like haven't even begun to sort of fully reckon with the consequences of this digital transformation in the gambling economy.
You mentioned a part that I want to know of with there's people have called it the sports betting, like epidemic, crisis. There's a lot of, I mean, I've worked, with the opioids and overdoses and the stimulants, and there's times where we use those things to call something, alarming, concerning, what's the next. And I think losing, with your book, I think part of it was like a public health crisis that's going
Yep.
on. Why, this is a tough question, is there are a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things that people, parents, schools are trying to pay attention to and they need to address. So like substance use, mental health, there's all these things. I think gambling is starting to get more awareness, but it still fights for attention compared to the other ones that gain more. I always say like the headlines for gambling are much different than substance use. Substance use, we hear about, a plane full of people pass away a day. Gambling, you hear about one person that got in trouble. You hear about one person that may have died by suicide, but it's not like these large numbers that raise awareness like other things do. It's like mental health, right? Mental health, same
Yep.
thing. So what's your talking point, or like what's your reasoning to why parents, schools, places that work with mental health, that work with substance use, why should this get more of my attention or more of my priority when I'm already trying to deal with all this other stuff going on? Like, because we see that being denied, right? We see people saying, well, we don't need this, or we don't have a problem with gambling, or we need to work on this. So why should they pay more attention or make more space, I guess, a seat at the table for gambling with everything else that they got going on?
Yeah. Okay. It's a fair question, and I could spend the next 6 hours sort of regaling you as to exactly why, but I'll try to focus my answer to at least only like 60 hours or 6 minutes. Um, so first of all, I think the harms, the evidence that we have of harms are sort of incontrovertible, in that, the, the advent of the arrival of online sports betting in the state is corresponding with increased bankruptcies, credit card delinquencies, auto loan delinquencies, reduced credit scores, lower investment and savings in lower income households, and so on. I think 60 something percent of people who bet at least $500 a month are unable to pay one of their bills or loans because of gambling debts, and so on. So there's all sorts of data that we have that online sports betting is bad or has the potential to cause harm to the individual who's gambling. Fine. Then we also have all this data on the prevalence and the massive, massive prevalence of gambling, especially among younger men. Estimates are that, basically half of 18 through 49-year-old men have a sports betting account. 25% of all men gamble at least 3 times a week. Lots of high schoolers, this is both through anecdotal reporting and some surveys, are seem to be gambling. Lots of 20-something men seem to be gambling. So, sort of whether you like it or not, the young men in your life are gambling. Whether it's on sports betting, whether it's on the stock market, whether it's through those cryptocurrency, through video game skins, you name it. They're gambling. I tell you, talk to a young person, talk to someone who knows young people, they are gambling. I've talked to teachers, I've talked to principals, sort of you name it. So it's sort of like where there's smoke, there's fire. It's like your kids are gambling. Do you want your kids, like I mean, quite literally, like your children or the students at your school or wherever, to have unfettered access to gambling on their phone and to be doing that without any adult supervision and any adult guidance? And the only messages they're receiving about gambling are from Jamie Foxx and Kevin Hart and LeBron James telling them how cool it is during a commercial break. If you do and that's fine, sure. Like, okay. I suspect that many of these same people who, as you say, are sort of need to create space for gambling know that they need to talk to kids about alcohol, about drugs, about tobacco, about pornography, about social media. And I would say for young people, specifically for young men, we have all this data about the harms of gambling addiction, which is the addiction, as you probably know, with the highest connection to suicide of any extent behavioral addiction. And it cannot be that young men or young anyone is just like left defenseless against these billion-dollar gambling corporations that want their money. And that's it. So I hope that sort of speaks for itself as to like this is a big problem, or it will be a big problem if you leave it alone and you don't do anything about it and you can help people. And I understand that students might not be so inclined to pay attention to like their gym teacher telling them not to gamble or like to pay, and that there's a crowded curriculum and sex ed and all these other things. But I think it is so has become so prevalent, it is clearly harmful and newly harmful and harmful in different ways than it ever has been before. That there needs to be some counter programming, whether it's from parents or teachers, or treatment providers. I'll take whatever I can get. But that's sort of the outline, I guess, of my case for the prosecution of we got to start somewhere, and we got to start somewhere with kids because they're uniquely vulnerable and they're being uniquely targeted.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because I think there's a lot of people who are trying to, they have been sounding the alarm or they have been saying, hey, we need this. They're having a hard time sometimes getting a foot in the door. I think what you just outlined was sometimes the quick elevator pitch or
Right.
the
Not so
proposal
quick,
where
but
you have
okay.
to
Yeah.
submit. Like we have to find a way to convince people to I don't have to convince people for me to talk about substance use or mental health. Like
Right.
that's
Right.
that's
Right.
pretty much like, oh yeah, like we need that. We got to talk about that. But this is one that we still have to sort of put some pressure on as to why. And I think you just gave a lot of reasons for a lot of people to use when they are trying to talk with schools, talk with athletes, talk in their communities, because people have been trying and they don't always get the best responses.
Yeah.
But
And
it's
and,
gonna be
and
a
I get
moment
it.
where they
Yeah.
say it's gonna be a moment where they say, "Oh yeah, now we need you because we had this
Right.
incident happen, or because this situation." Like it's just gonna take something happening to a high school athlete or to a high school kid or something to then all of a sudden be like, "Well, now we have to because this happened," versus you could have done it when we first approached you.
100%. And I mean, to take your analogy about opioids, it was for better and for worse, right? Like with the opioid crisis, right? It's like, okay, the entire southwestern Virginia and the state of West Virginia have just been wiped out. I mean, there's sort of a clear, not only those places, of course, but there was sort of a clear geographic concentration where you could sort of like see, like in the aftermath of an atomic bomb, you could sort of like see and viscerally feel the consequences. And with this, that's not going to happen, right? Like lots of people, even young people, are going to be able to gamble safely, but a couple of them aren't. And like, it's like a couple of kids at every high school in the entire country, right? That to me sort of becomes the scale of a crisis. It's just geographically diffused and harder to see compared to something like the opioid crisis, which has that sort of geographic concentration. So yeah, if I don't know, I don't think a treatment provider or an educator would be okay with like, hey, one out of every 100 kids at your school is going to get wiped out by gambling. Like, I don't think they'd be like, oh, okay, that's fine. We'll just like bake that in. No, I think they would do something about that. And you're right. I think the time to do it is before something happens, not after.
And I like how you mentioned the geographical part because I think gambling's always what I call hidden in plain sight. Like
Yeah.
it's not that we can't see it, it's right there, but also it hides right when it's there because it's you can't tell now that someone's on their phone and they might be like
Yeah, they
parents
might
or
be
other
on a dating
people.
app or whatever. Like
Yeah,
whatever. Who
yeah,
knows what they're
used to,
doing?
yeah,
Yeah.
used to worry that like, well, they're not going to the casino, or they're not. I'm not seeing them do like, scratch offs, or I'm not seeing them like do all these things when it's like that's much easier to see. That's much easier to even be aware of. But they could be doing that very said thing on their phone, and you wouldn't know. So that's where I think sometimes the messaging is that sometimes parents and others you just don't know. And we're trying to help you be aware of it, because for one or two in that classroom, like this could be a significant thing that's going on. But to pretend with all this expansion, all this changes,
Yeah.
to act like it's not going on is part of what do we think's happening then? Like, do we think all this is being legalized and going on, but no one's partaking or no one's
Right.
doing it? Like this all wouldn't be happening if there weren't people engaging and people being a part of it. So I think that's part of the discussion, is that look at all this is happening is clearly people are gambling, and doesn't mean everyone's going to have an issue with it, but we can do things to help screen, assess, provide resources to those who do. So I guess that leads to I mean, this has been a great talk. I feel like we could talk about this topic in your book for a while. I guess part of my your final takeaway, or for audience members, would be you mentioned before your mention of reckless, and what would you say are some things that we could do to to minimize or to limit that recklessness? What are ways that we could begin to put up some kind of guardrails, even if it's not exactly what we want? Because I also sometimes think we get into this all or nothing, where it's either things won't get better till this completely gets shut down or this doesn't. But to me, I'm like, we got to find some, what can I do now? What can I do, going forward? I'm not going to wait for something to happen for me to feel like I can make a difference. What are some ways we can change the recklessness, either small scale or large scale, going forward, knowing how things are with where we are today in sports betting?
Yeah. I mean, let's start like legislatively or regulatorily, right? Like even if these feel like sort of pipe dreams at this point, right? But like anything to add friction to the apps, right? To reduce the number of deposits you can make per day, to add a holding period. So when you do deposit money, you have to wait 12 to 24 hours before you can gamble with it. Removing these insane betting markets like Malaysian women's doubles badminton or whatever, or the speed of the next pitch that are just like absolute trapdoors for someone with gambling addiction. It's something that no normal sports fan would actually like think to bet on because it's fun to bet on Malaysian women's doubles badminton. So let's start there, and that would be great. I'm not sort of so optimistic that that's going to happen sort of soon. So then I think there are other things that maybe even parents or teachers can do to, let's say, impose some friction, right? Like I don't know, I don't want to be like big nanny state, like, but like making sure your kid doesn't have like a gambling app on their phone, right? Lots of parents sort of in the immediate aftermath of the arrival of sports betting, like started gambling with their kid. Okay, fine, that's your decision, but like don't do it on your kid's phone, do it on your phone. Like like make them like do it in a way that is supervised, that is safe, that is understood. And then I think as banal as and hopefully not benign as it is, but like maybe, but having the conversations that you mentioned, and again, if you think that your kid is not gambling, I promise you they are, or they know kids who are. Full stop. I don't care where you live. I don't care what kind of school they're in. In fact, if they're in a nicer, richer school, I bet it's more likely that they know people who are gambling and that they are gambling. So at the very least, having these conversations, or up to sort of taking these sort of proactive protective steps that you might take with something like pornography or drugs or alcohol to prevent them, the way gambling, I don't need to tell you, but the way so much of gambling harm works, right? It's like this sort of the snowball effect. And the reason I want to sort of add friction is sort of add speed bumps on the hill to prevent someone from sort of picking up steam with their gambling. And so the degree to which parents can sort of institute some of that friction themselves or stop the snowball from rolling is I think the best chance we have, at least in the short term, of fixing some of the cultural normalization, fixing some of the frictionlessness, or fixing how we handle sort of the casino that's suddenly arrived in our pocket.
Yeah, those are those are great, and I think those are things that people think that they can do now, that they can take action towards, some bigger than others. Because I just think like I like the snowball part to it. Like we're not we're just trying to make sure there's like speed bumps, guardrails, so that it doesn't just build and build and build, because it can quickly accelerate. And
Yeah.
even with online, betting through apps, like it can accelerate because there's not that friction that there used to be uh, in the past as much with some traditional styles of how gambling was, where sports betting and online can really be quite a big snowball, like the cartoon, where all of a sudden it just is
Yeah.
giant. And part of us would have wished we could have done some things to prevent that from happening. So I really want to thank you for coming on the podcast, talking about it. Your book, Losing Big: America's Reckless Bet on Sports Gambling, I said is so it was amazing. I was so appreciative. It goes a lot of when people ask about gambling or where's a good place to start with sports betting, what's going on with it. Already, this has been the book where I say this is the place to get an idea of what happened, of what's going on, and some areas of what we can do. So I really appreciate the work you did with it and for talking to us about this, because there's going to be more people in the future wanting to hear this conversation. They're going to want to know what's going on with it. So I really appreciate everything you've done and for coming and talking on the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for the work you're doing and for, your nice words about the book. And I hope folks feel comfortable as you did to sort of reach out hopefully to tell me that they like the book, or with questions or follow up, or anything I can do to help their work.
Yeah, and we'll have links where people can reach out to you, learn more about you, or connect with you and find your book, because it's going to be a very worthwhile resource for them. So thanks again for
Yeah.
joining, and appreciate the time you spent talking to us today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Talking Addiction and Recovery with Andrew J. Schreier. We're so glad you've joined us and invite you to connect further with the show and these topics at www.andrewjschreier.com. That's Andrew J. SCHREIER.com. You can also email us directly at talkingaddictionandrecovery@gmail.com and connect on social media, Instagram at Talking Addiction and Recovery, Facebook Talking Addiction and Recovery Podcast, and Twitter at TalkAR_podcast. To stay connected and never miss an episode, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe. Until next time, friends, let's keep talking addiction and recovery.